Thank you so much also for giving us that context on common assessments. I see some people that are maybe starting to do it next year. I see some others that have been doing it for a little while. So that's really, really cool that we have a huge mix of people here. And if you've never used them and you're trying to learn, this is a great place to be, really. So in just a couple seconds, we're going to start and we're going to introduce ourselves now that you've already done so. Just to let you know a little bit more about who we are and what we're going to do today.
All right, and I'll go ahead and introduce myself first. So my name is Emily Miller, and prior to being with Inner Orbit, I was a high school chemistry teacher for 10 years. And during that time, I taught in our alternative learning program, I taught regular chem, and I taught honors chem.
Now, as for me, I was a teacher and tutor for elementary students in the Dominican Republic for about 4 years. And then now I've been supporting teachers in districts with working with the NGSS for the last 4 years. So I've been partnering and providing guidance to schools and districts implementing assessments in their NGSS instruction and working with Inner Orbit doing so. And for me, patio season is really fun. Let me just go ahead and walk us through our agenda. So today we're going to dive into common assessments that drive NGSS growth. And our objective today is to gain insights into how NGSS common assessments are driving science growth in real districts and reflect how a common assessment strategy might support your own instructional or program goals. We're going to be here for about 60 minutes. And first, we're going to talk about what Inner Orbit is. After that, we're going to define what a common assessment is. We're going to talk about some common assessment types, which are growth assessments. And Emily is going to go into some specific districts and some specific use cases for this. We're going to talk about growth assessments, curricular benchmarks, common unit assessments, common formative assessments, and finally, we'll talk about what we could do next. And then we're going to wrap up. So I'm really excited to show you about all of this. All right, so let's talk and let's start with what is Inner Orbit first. And now Inner Orbit is an NGSS assessment, report, and practice platform for science educators for grades 3 through high school. And I promise we're going to talk about assessments more, but just as for context, we're just going to give you a little insight on what Inner Orbit is. But we are providing high integrity assessments that give you meaningful and actionable student data. So we start with phenomena that are real world events that students can connect with, and these anchor every assessment so that learning feels relevant and authentic. Then from there, our platform delivers three-dimensional assessments that let students demonstrate what they know and how they think, not just what they memorized. And finally, educators and districts get these powerful reports that surface three-dimensional learning data aligned to state tests, helping them make those informed decisions towards NGSS and tracking NGSS proficiency for students. Now, one of the things that really sets Inner Orbit apart is how we make NGSS accessible for both teachers and students. So we know that navigating the 3 dimensions of the standards can be overwhelming, so we focus on supporting innovative sense-making every step of the way. So we have scaffolded questions with types 1-dimensional, 2-dimensional, and 3-dimensionals so that educators have total flexibility. So if you're designing maybe a quick check-in, a performance task, or even gathering district-wide data, you can build these assessments that fits the goals. And then finally, we always try to empower science educator with the guidance, supporting resources, professional development that is needed to confidently navigate 3-dimensional assessments. So as leaders in NGSS assessments, we go beyond just having this platform. We're constantly sharing best practices through webinars like this one, personalized support and professional development that helps teachers and admin and students build a strong foundation in 3-dimensional assessments. Now, let's dive into today's assessment strategy, that is common assessments. Without further ado, now we're really going to focus on what the strategy is and how we define it. So when it comes to assessing the NGSS, there are 3 main paths that you can take. And at Inner Orbit, we call these the assessment orbits. The first one right here at the top, as you can see, is sense-making practice. So this is where we start introducing 3 dimensions, phenomena-driven assessments in a more informal way to build student comfort and engagement. Next, we have individual assessments, and this is where educators can design their own classroom assessments tailored to their specific instruction and their data needs. And finally, we have common assessment, which is our focus for today. And these provide consistent 3-dimensional data across classrooms or schools and help districts track NGSS proficiency at scale. So Inner Orbit supports all 3 of these orbits, helping you move confidently from where you are to where you want to be. Again, we will be hosting, if we're done today and you're like, oh, maybe common assessments is a little too advanced for us, we will be hosting 2 other webinars on the other orbits next week and the week after. So we'll drop those links in the chat later on so that you can sign up if you're interested. Now, zooming into common assessments, which is our focus for today, at their core, these assessments are given by teacher teams who teach the same content or grade level. And they're a way to align instruction and ensure that we're all measuring learning in the same way. And the purpose behind them is that they create space for collaborative data discussions so that we can work together to understand what our students need and how we can respond together as a team. And the goal really is about efficiency for teachers and equity for students. So whenever student is assessed using the same tool, it helps us ensure that instructional decisions aren't made in isolation and they're informed by a broader view of student learning. Now, we'd love to hear from you. And what do you see as the greatest benefits of using common assessment? Thank you so much for answering. Okay, so we see that about 43% of us are here because we really want that data. Then some of us want to establish clear and consistent learning expectations, and others want to strengthen collaboration. This is really cool because we really feel that one of the best use cases for common assessments is to really use that data and adjust instruction. We'll see how that plays into it in the next few slides, but that's really, really cool insight for us to know and understand what you're really trying to look for here. Now, now it's really important to recognize that common assessments are most effective when the conditions are right for success. And they really thrive in environments where teams of teachers have a shared aligned curriculum, common planning time, and the support to use data for making instructional adjustments. So before into saying, yes, we're going to jump into common assessments, we could pause and ask a few key questions. Maybe we ask, is the curriculum aligned across our teaching teams? Do teachers have these regular opportunities to plan together? And how often do we want or need this data to be collected? And then towards the end, critically, we need to know, is there time built for teachers to actually make these changes based on that data? So if you're unsure about the answers of any of these, maybe another assessment tool like individual assessment or sense-making practice might be a more supportive starting point, because the goal at the end of the day isn't to force a structure, it's to set teams up for success with the right tools at the right time. Now, when we talk about common assessments, we have 4 different types that we're going to dive into today. We might use growth assessments, and these are used mainly to track progress over time and measure how students are developing their 3-dimensional thinking. Curricular benchmarks are also there to check in at key points during the year and ensure that students are on track with district pacing. We also have unit assessments. They're tied closely to the instruction that just happened, and they're great for capturing what students took away from a specific set of lessons. And then finally, formative assessments. And these are smaller, more flexible tools that help teams adjust instruction in real time based on student understanding. And all of these can be common when they're shared across the team. And we're going to see some of these use cases in different districts that we partner with today. But before we do that, we really want to go into some NGSS assessment terminology. Specifically, let's talk about performance expectations first. And this is for people that maybe are not necessarily familiar, just 1 minute on this. But unlike traditional standards that often focus on isolated facts or skills, a performance expectation tells us what students should be actually able to do to demonstrate their understanding. And this means that every performance expectation integrates all 3 dimensions of the NGSS, so the DCI, the SEP, and the cross-cutting concept together. So you can see in the example that we're going to show you below, all 3 of these dimensions come together into one performance-based outcome. So students aren't just recalling facts, they're really making sense of the phenomena and showing their thinking in action. Now, when we talk about the DCI, we know we're talking about the science content. When we talk about the science and engineering practices, we're really talking about how and reflecting how students work and they think. And these cross-cutting concepts, they're big ideas or lenses, as we call them in our team, that help students connect learning across different domains. And now that we know what a performance expectation is, let's talk about how we assess it. So to truly meet a performance expectation, students need to answer questions that integrate all three dimensions, the DCI, the SCP, and the cross-cutting concept. And we call these three-dimensional questions because they required students not just to know science, but actually to apply it and to think like scientists. But getting students to that point takes really intentional scaffolding. And that's where one-dimensional and two-dimensional questions come in, as one of our people were saying in our chat. So a one-dimensional question focuses only on one dimension, in this case, focused on the DCI only. So just the content. These are the most common recall questions that we always see, or representation questions. Now, a two-dimensional question can bring in two dimensions, like maybe the content and practices when we combine the DCI and the SCP, or the content and the cross-cutting concepts when we combine the DCI and the CCCs. And finally, a three-dimensional question integrates all three of these questions, all three dimensions, requiring students to apply their knowledge, use scientific reasoning, and connect ideas across these concepts. So using these progressions, one-dimensional to two-dimensional to three-dimensional, not only supports students in building deeper understanding, but it also gives educators a clear pathway to develop sense-making skills over time. And now, with all this context, I'm going to actually give Emily a floor so she can talk to us about each of these types of assessments and give us some examples on how we partner with districts that actually use these strategies.
Thank you so much, Julia. And thank you all. So Julia did an awesome job explaining essentially like the basics behind a common assessment, the general goals, and the 4 different types of common assessments that you could utilize as a common assessment strategy. And the first one that I really want to dive into are those growth assessments. So growth assessments, their goal is to give a summative assessment twice. You want to give it once before instruction and once after instruction. And the purpose behind doing that is in order to measure student growth over time. So essentially you want to get some baseline information of where my students are at currently, give them some instruction, and then see where they are after that point. There's some different names for this. We kind of bundled a lot of different growth assessments into this one category. So you might have heard like mastery benchmarks, or like a pre-post test for a unit, or a student learning or student growth objective. And this could look like a lot of different things. So you could give a pre-assessment at the beginning of the year. You could give one in the middle. You could give one at the end. You could also choose to focus on different information. So for example, maybe your district is looking at a few key performance expectations or priority standards, and that's what you want to measure growth on. Or maybe you want to look at one particular unit that you're teaching in your scope and sequence, and you want to see growth before the unit and after. So there's a lot of ways to kind of decide how you want to measure this growth, if you want to look at it on a more larger scale or a smaller scale. But essentially, the essence of this common assessment is we want to see where students are at the beginning, and then hopefully measure their growth over time. The district example that we want to share with you. So this is an actual district that partners with InterOrbit and uses InterOrbit to administer this growth assessment. Since we are sharing real data from this district, we are not at liberty to share the actual district name, but we can tell you a little bit of information and context. So the district we're going to be talking about is a large district in California within LA County, and the growth assessment that they administer are grade level benchmarks. So within each grade level, they create an assessment that they give at the beginning of the year and then again at the end of the year to measure growth within each grade level. And like I mentioned, they do that at the beginning and the end of the year. So these assessments that they administer, they're all 12 questions, and they all focus on priority standards. And they only pick 2D and 3D questions. So like Julia was mentioning, the goal, the mastery of the NGSS is to incorporate all 3 dimensions within one question. And 2D questions are great because they're also layering in that content with either like a skill or a cross-cutting concept. So this way they're really measuring if students are truly understanding these priority standards that they've picked. And what's important about this is this assessment that they're giving, this growth assessment, is the same assessment. It's identical. So the same questions, the same phenomena, the same standards. To truly see if you've measured that growth, you want to be able to give students that same assessment. Now, looking at these pictures here, you're going to notice that we've got a 5th grade common assessment, a 4th grade, and a 3rd grade on the top. And then you're going to look below and see 3rd grade sixth grade and fifth grade. So what they've done is, while these don't necessarily look the same, the content of the assessment is the exact same. They just changed like the thumbnail so it was easy for them to differentiate which one they were looking at. And I wanted to give you all an opportunity to kind of give a deeper dive of what these particular grade level benchmark assessments look like. So the one that I picked for us to kind of do a deeper dive into is their fifth grade growth benchmark. So this is administered to all the fifth graders within this district. They give this benchmark at the beginning of the year, and then they give the exact same benchmark again at the end of the year. And the priority standards that this district has focused to work on is 5 LS11, 5 ESS21, 5 PS11, 5 PS12. There are a lot of different methodologies and reasonings behind picking different priority standards. It really kind of depends on what you and your team want to focus on, but these are the 4 that they picked for fifth grade. So what they did is they gave this initial fifth grade science common assessment at the beginning of the year. Then they made an exact copy of that assessment and gave that same assessment at the end of the year. So just to give you a little snapshot of what that actually looked like. One of the phenomena that they chose was, how do these leaves leave the forest floor? So students are investigating an investigation that other students conducted where they put leaves within a compost bin, and then they measured the weight of that compost bin over time, over the span of an entire year. So the standard affiliated with this phenomena is 5 PS12. So the DCI for 5 PS12 is structure and properties of matter. The SEP is using mathematics and computational thinking, and the CCC is scale, proportion, and quantity. And for this particular standard, these were the 3 questions that they chose to assess students on. So they pulled a 2D question focusing on the SEP and the DCI, another 2D question focusing again on the SEP and the DCI, and a 3D question focusing on all 3. So this is just one phenomena, one standard, 3 questions on this larger assessment that actually included 4 standards, 4 phenomena, 3 questions each. And they gave this same assessment at the beginning and at the end of the year. And again, we call these our growth assessments because the goal is growth, which this district did in fact see. So at the beginning of the year, students scored an average of 46% on this assessment. Those little bars you see there are kind of like proficiency cutoffs. Within Inner Orbit, you can personalize what you want your proficiency cutoff to be. For simplicity's sake, let's just imagine this is like a 4-1. So the green being a 4, yellow being a 3, etc. And then when they gave the same assessment, again at the end of the year, they saw a growth of 46% to 52% and more students becoming proficient as well. And then also with Inner Orbit, you don't just get that one overall larger number. You can actually see how students improved on every element of those standards. So for example, you can see how students increased their performance on the DCIs with those priority standards. You can see how they increased performance within those standards. And you can also see how they increase their understanding of the cross-cutting concepts within those standards. So not only do you get that kind of collective, like, okay, yay, we saw growth, you can actually specifically see in what areas you saw growth, which ones you saw the most, which ones you saw the least, to then give you that data and information to make instructional shifts for that next year's curriculum. So that was a little bit about growth assessments. Again, just kind of giving an overall understanding of what they are and the purpose behind them, and then giving you an example of how a district uses growth assessments and Inner Orbit. The next one I wanted to talk about was curricular benchmarks. So curricular benchmarks are summative assessments that focus on performance expectations taught in a certain pacing or curriculum. And the purpose behind these curricular benchmarks is to measure student proficiency to reflect on the impact of curriculum and instruction. Essentially, this is a way for you to figure out, is my curriculum and instruction doing what it's supposed to do? Is it truly preparing students for mastery of the standards within that curriculum and within that unit? And we can call these unit tests. Final exams and proficiency exams are probably the most common. So think of this as like a final exam you would give at the end of a class to then be like, okay, did my curriculum do its job? Did they learn what they needed to learn within this class with this curriculum? This can look like a few different things. Generally, you want to give this at the end. So either at the end of a quarter or at the end of a semester to check progress, or you could just do it at the end of the year or the end of the course. So again, this one kind of depends on how often you want that data. But again, you kind of want to look at the curriculum and instruction holistically. The example that we're going to talk a little bit more about as far as curricular benchmarks go is a district in Connecticut. And what they did is they did curricular benchmarks with all of their different like core subjects. So for example, all these curricular benchmarks were about 15 questions, and they picked 5 standards within the curriculum or 5 performance expectations. And again, with it being summative, they made sure that they picked 2D and 3D questions to really measure that proficiency. So for example, this is their biology mid-year assessment. So they just kind of looked at the curriculum and instruction in the beginning half of the year, and was the curriculum doing its job to teach students these core biology standards. And they give it each year. So they'll give it 1 year to the next, so they can keep having that benchmark to assess themselves on and the curriculum on year after year. How they physically did it is these were actually created by the administrators. So whether it was a science director or a curriculum director or like the head of the science department, they had an administrator building these assessments out, and then it was given by all the teachers within that PLC. So to, again, show you a little bit more of what that assessment actually looked like. So we are looking at the high school biology one as an example. It was 15 questions, 2D and 3D. And the standards they chose to focus on to assess this biology curriculum was HSLS 1-2, 1-7-4-1, all high school, all life science. And then they picked standards from LS1 and LS4 because that was the information that had been taught by that mid-year point. The questions I'm about to show you are assessing the standard HSLS1-2. So the SEP for this is developing and using models. The DCI is structure and function. And the CCC is systems and systems models. So the phenomena that was chosen for this assessment was, why do some people stop breathing at night? And students were given different diagrams of the brain and the brainstem and the respiratory system. So one of the questions they pulled was a 2D question focusing on the SCP and the DCI. Another one was focusing on the CCC and the DCI. And the other one was a 3-dimensional question focusing on all 3 dimensions. So because for this one, they picked 5 different standards, in this assessment, there would have been 5 different phenomena. So each phenomena would have been tied to a different standard. And with each of those standards, they picked about 3 questions, 2D and 3D, in order to measure the mastery of that standard. The data that you can get as a result of a curricular benchmark is going to be really similar to what we saw on the growth benchmarks. So you can see how are students doing on those like core DCIs that we picked, because they had just picked LS1 and LS4. How are they doing on the science and engineering practices associated with those standards, and then the cross-cutting concepts as well. And one thing that I really wanted to take a moment to feature for you all here is how detailed this dimensions report can go within inner orbit. So we can see overall that students on average did 81% on LS1, but we can actually break that information down farther and see how they did on HSLS1-2 versus HSLS1-3. So if we actually break this down farther, they seem to do better on LS1-3 versus LS1-2. And then we can also compare this to LS1C. So we can break this down from like the main standard to the substandards, and you can break it down as well within the SEP and the CCCs too. So for example, if we're looking at constructing explanations and designing solutions, we can sit there and see what grade level expectations were met within that SEP and what percentage of students were proficient within that as well. So you can really break this down and really get into the nitty-gritty if you want to see if your curriculum instruction is supporting the standards you want students to learn within that course. The next common assessment I want to talk about is probably at least the most common common assessment, at least when I was a teacher, which is just unit assessments. So these are summative assessments that are given at the end of a unit. So curricular benchmarks really look at the entire curriculum and instruction over a larger span of time, where a unit assessments is just like that one chunk in that one unit. The purpose is to provide educators with these pre-built assessments in order to gather that school district student data. So with unit assessments, you're getting data more frequently in order to see kind of more information about the entire journey within the curriculum instruction rather than just a snapshot at the end. And what's interesting with this is you can do unit diagnostics, formatives, or summatives. So when you're doing these unit assessments, you can choose to gather data at the beginning, in the middle, or at the end, depending on what kind of data you and your group would want to collect. So these can look like, again, those diagnostics about maybe you're building diagnostics on prior knowledge because you want to gather that data of what students know before you enter a unit. Or maybe you're giving that unit summative at the end in order to see if students mastered the material within that unit. The district example that we're going to go look at is a district within New Jersey, and they are using these unit assessments, and they chose to do summative unit assessments. So they're giving a unit assessment at the end of a unit. So because there are so many unit assessments within this district, there's a little bit more variability. So the assessments generally range from 13 to 18 questions. They focus on the standards that were taught within that unit. And they also did a mixture of 1D, 2D, and 3D questions. Because this was over a shorter span of time, they were able to collect a little bit more data on how students were doing on just DCI questions and those three-dimensional questions as well. So these are some snapshots of their chemistry unit assessments. These is a snapshot of their physics unit assessments, and they built these unit assessments again for all of their core subjects and their core grades. So 8th grade, 7th grade, 6th grade as well. The way that this district did this is initially all of these common unit assessments were built by an administrator, but over time, teachers would give feedback and revisions, and they've slowly changed and morphed over time. What was nice about this was, as many of you know, if you have tackled common assessments, is it's a lot to tackle. And so the administrators wanted to give teachers this resource to help save them time initially. But then they wanted it to be a collaborative experience from then on, since teachers were actually giving these assessments and doing the instruction. So they've been able to change and morph over time. But the administrators wanted to give them that initial starting point in order to help save that time and bandwidth to kind of get this common assessment strategy up and running. So just to show you a little bit more about what these assessments looked like, the other deep dive assessment examples I showed you were showing some of the questions. And now I want to show you a little bit more like zoomed out of like what the assessment might look like on a larger scale. So I chose for us to look at a high school physics common assessment. This particular assessment was 16 questions, 2D and 3D questions. And this unit assessment focused on the standards HSPS 4.1, 4.2, and 4.5. So you can see right there, they're all PS4 and then 2, 4, 3, 4, 5. All of these were within the same unit. So all these standards are similar to each other and kind of build off of one another. So because they picked 4 standards, this assessment had 4 phenomena. So I wanted to show you, I'd mentioned that before with some of the other ones, but I kind of wanted to show you a little bit more variety with the phenomena that you could see within the same assessment. So within the same assessment, students would be looking at x-rays and then digital technology about an old buffalo video, and then rainbows, and then straws, and the late night show apparently as well. So students are getting experiences with a lot of different phenomena and applying what they've learned in a lot of new and novel situations, even within that same assessment, again, to really see, can they apply what they've learned to something new? The data that you can get as a result of these unit assessments, you can still see how students are doing in the DCIs, S and CCCs. I've shown you this. But I also wanted to highlight another report that we have at InterOrbit called our district reports. So this district is a larger district. They've got 3 high schools within the district. And what's interesting is we can look at that SCP, CCC, and DCI data, but we can actually, rather than having it all conglomerated, we could break it apart into different school sites. So what's interesting here is, for example, when we're looking at, say, engaging in argument from evidence, which was at 49% as an average. When we go and we look at the different high schools C seems to actually be doing like a decent chunk better than high schools A and B. So that might be an interesting opportunity to have a conversation with high school C and say like, what'd y'all do during this part? And, then you've got the one teacher who's like, oh my gosh, yeah, I went to this conference and I found this cool activity and I shared it. And it gives you these opportunities to have more collaborative data discussions because you have more detail to go off of. This isn't an opportunity to necessarily like point fingers, but this is an opportunity to identify those patterns and trends and to notice where some of those strengths are, to see if you can kind of group your teams together and share that wealth of knowledge that everybody has and everybody's doing within their classrooms. And then finally, the last common assessment strategy I wanted to talk to you all about is common formative assessments. So common formative assessments are assessments that focus on just a single performance expectation, or if you want to think about it as just like one lesson, and it has a mixture of 1D, 2D, and 3D questions within it. The purpose for this is to get data right now to make shifts right now. So it's this idea of before you move on, let's check in and see how they're doing. And if things are going well, awesome, we can keep going. And if things aren't going well, now we have some data to let us know how to pause, how to pivot, and where we need to give that support before we move forward. You can think of these as like exit slips, check quizzes, bell ringers. They're supposed to be short. So they're supposed to be short, succinct, and give you enough information in order to know how to shift your instruction. This can look like building a bank, like a huge bank of common formative assessments on every single like performance expectation that's going to be taught, or maybe you just pick a few performance expectations, like your priority standards, for example, and maybe you just give these CFAs a few times throughout the year. So this really kind of depends on your bandwidth of like you, your administration, and your teachers on how often you want these formative assessments to be given and how often you want them to be common as well amongst your team. The district example we're going to do a deep dive with here is a district in Oklahoma. And they utilize these common formative assessments and they do them multiple times throughout the year. So their common formative assessments, like I mentioned, they're short. So they're just 5 questions. And this is a large district. So they just chose to make a bank of priority standards. So they didn't do every single standard within every single grade level. They just picked a few priority ones and said, we really want you to give these CFAs for these standards. And what was interesting here is they kind of brought in a little bit of like the growth strategy within these CFAs. So what they did is they gave this version A. So please give this common formative assessment. Let's see how your teachers and let's see how your students are doing. And then after there was some intervention, right? Because that's the whole point of a formative assessment is to gather some knowledge right now and make changes now based on what we just learned. Then what they did is they created a version B, which was the same, but a different phenomena. So I want to point this out here. These 2 ones up here, the one with the diamond and the one with the forest, both of these are 7 PS11. So the same standard, but they picked questions from a diamond phenomena for version A, and then they picked questions from the forest phenomena for version B. And then you can see again another example here for 8LS41. They've got a version A and then they've got a version B. What's interesting with this is truly, if students have mastered the NGSS, they should be able to take what they've learned and apply it to new situations. If you've been doing the NGSS for a while, we know that this is a bigger lift than just what the one sentence I just said. But what's interesting with this strategy is you can really start seeing where students might need that additional support in order to hopefully get to that mastery level. So I wanted to show you again a little bit more in depth of what this looked like. So I chose to dive into an 8th grade CFA, Common Formative Assessment. Again, these are 5 questions, 1D, 2D, and 3D, and I picked the standard 8LS41. So what I'm going to show you is kind of what this version A and version B actually looks like. So what they did is they grabbed that first phenomena, which is what can we learn from a sea dragon? And they picked a 2D question from that focused on the SEP and the DCI. Then when they made version B about tiny horses, they picked a 2-dimensional question with the SEP and the DCI. These are 2 different questions, but these 2 questions are assessing the same SEP and the same DCI. So we're getting at the same core with both questions, even though they are different and they're looking at different phenomena. And I'll show you one more example here of the 3-dimensional question. So again, we've got that what can we learn from a sea dragon, version A, and then we can see the 3-dimensional question they picked with the tiny horses then as well. So again, different questions, they're doing different things, but they're different questions asking different things, but they're getting to the core of the same thing at the end of the day. Now what's cool is the data that you can get as a result from this. And again, I wanted to feature another data report and highlight that within Inner Orbit. So we've got this version A and this version B. And what we can do is we can actually do an item analysis and we can see how students did on a particular item. Now, for the sake of the screen, I didn't show what they did for like each selection choice, but you can see like 44.5% of students picked the right answer, and then 25 picked B, and 13 picked C. So you can see how many students picked each option, and then you can also see just overall how well students did. So you can see for this particular CFA, going from version A to version B, even though these were different questions and different phenomena, there was growth on this SCP of analyzing and interpreting data. So students were able to increase their ability to analyze and interpret data due to teachers getting the information that students needed more support with this SCP partway through. They were able to intervene, reassess, and actually see that that intervention paid off. Thank you so much for doing this deep dive of some different inner orbit partners with me. We looked at a lot of data, we looked at a lot of questions, and now Julie is going to talk about a couple next steps, and then we'll be wrapping ourselves up here.
Okay, so now that we've talked about different types of common assessments, what is the best type that fits our own context, right? So what are we going to do next? For that, I got you a quick little cheat sheet to help you think about the different types of common assessments, when to use them, and what they're best for. So just as a recap, going back on the things that we just talked about, first, we have growth assessments. They help you measure student progress over time, and these are great pre-post assessments across the unit or a school year. We remember that in the example that we saw, they were using the same assessment twice, and they were understanding maybe in the beginning of the year, then towards the end of the year, to understand how impactful was the instruction that we used in the school year. Then we have the curricular benchmarks, and these are used to check how well students are mastering the content that we've taught. So usually they're given at the end of the unit, at the end of the quarter, or at the end of the year. And these, as Emily called them, they're called the final exams. And these are usually, they're called among students and teachers. Now, these unit assessments are more focused, and they track learning within a specific unit and can be used at the start, at the middle, or at the end of the unit just to check in on student understanding. And finally, formative assessments are a little bit more flexible because they're used ongoing and during lessons to adjust instruction in real time based on student need. On the example that we saw from our partner district in Oklahoma, actually, we saw that they used two different versions. And the main difference between the growth assessments is that the growth assessments were using the same assessment twice, one in the beginning, one towards the end. These formative assessments, actually, we use different phenomena, we use different questions, but we were assessing the same standard to understand if students are really transferring that knowledge and if they're really understanding and making sense of these novel scenarios. Now, we would love to know in the chat, which of these assessment types would best fit your district's context? So if you want to give us a quick answer in the chat, we'd love to know what you're thinking right now. If you feel that any of these could be really helpful for you and your teachers. I know some of you, okay, cool. So we see some answers. I know that some of you may be really starting to implement these. Others, as you said in the beginning, have already been implementing these common assessments for a little while, and you wanted to be here for a little bit more information. Okay, so we see that the unit assessments are very common here. So yeah, it's really nice to see. So if you're still typing, please keep doing so. But for the sake of time, we really want to understand and tell you, what if you're not ready for common assessments? Not everybody has to be, and this is not necessarily the most common starting point. So if you're really hesitant to say maybe we're still not ready, there are other lower list practices that you could still use to integrate assessment into your NGSS progressions. So for these, we're going to have two different webinars in the next few days. We're going to have on Tuesday, July 29th, we're actually going to have another webinar on individual assessments. And these are teacher-graded assessments aligned to specific standards. So if you want to join us, I'll drop the link in the chat. And then we'll also have the sense-making practice webinar. And these are informal opportunities for students to apply three-dimensional thinking. Maybe students are still not ready to sit down with pen and paper or with a computer to actually answer these questions. So how do we build the confidence with them? How do we create activities in the classroom that will help them get there? I know we're talking about scaffolding questions, but maybe we also need to think about scaffolding the activities that we're using. And that's also what sense-making practice is and what we're going to talk about on that webinar on Wednesday, August 6th. So you can start small, build confidence, and then grow from there. So if you want to join us, I just dropped the links in the chat. If you haven't signed up for any of those and you are interested, please do so whenever you can. And now it's been about 15 minutes. If you want to learn more about InOrbit and you actually want to maybe see how this could work in your district, I'm going to drop a link in the chat that leads to a Google form. So thank you so much again, and let us know if there are any questions.